This is London.
Hello and welcome back to Retrovision and part 6 from Vulcans, Victors and Cuba, the penultimate episode. And we're dealing with the secret bunker that was in Corsham near Bath, which is where the government were due to be evacuated to if things got substantially worse in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we got access to those bunkers, or what remains of them, and you'll see some of the footage here. Hope you find it interesting.
During the past year, the United Kingdom has emphasized the use of Skybolt as a major weapon in its arsenal. British studies indicated that the Vulcan Mark II bomber would be adopted as the GAM-87A carrier. Skybolt, the most flexible weapon system in advanced stages of development in the free world today, continues to meet scheduled milestones in anticipation of its operational date, October 1964.
Despite this PR film's very positive gloss, the Skybolt program was in trouble. Dogged with technical problems and failing to perform in several key tests, it was finally cancelled by US Congress in 1962. With the scrapping of Skybolt and blue steel still being perfected, the approaching Cuban crisis would test the V-force to its limits.
Certainly this did have an effect on the crews. It had a big stress on family life. We had quite a lot of divorces in V-force, for instance, ulcers, a few nervous breakdowns, a couple of suicides that I know about. Yes, there was a fair amount of stress around at the time, yes.
I know that you have all heard about hydrogen bombs. Perhaps, too, you have heard of something called radioactive fallout, which comes from both atomic and hydrogen weapons. All nuclear weapons, atomic and hydrogen bombs alike, produce radioactivity. With the smaller atomic weapons, we did not have to worry too much about fallout. With the larger atomic bombs, and especially with hydrogen weapons, radioactive dust will fall to Earth far beyond the range of fire and blast in the direction of the prevailing winds at the time of the explosion. Now, I'm not here to try and frighten you. As a matter of fact, Americans just don't scare easily anyway. And it's a good thing that they don't in this atomic age. Basically, there are only two things you need to know how to do to protect your life. One is to evacuate your city before the bomb falls. Because obviously, if you are caught in the open, near ground zero, you won't have to worry about radiation. The bomb itself will kill you. The other method is to dig deep enough into the ground to escape the effects of blast and heat and radiation. Suppose now that you get little or no warning. Almost any kind of shelter can reduce the danger of radiation. Now, I won't mince words with you. If you happen to be caught downwind in the path of the fallout and without any shelter, and if you don't get into shelter just as rapidly as you can, these radioactive particles could cause your death.
The early 60s were to be an extremely dangerous period for the whole planet. For the first time, the collective US and Soviet nuclear arsenal had the explosive potential to wipe out life on Earth. And the events that could trigger this nuclear Armageddon seem to be occurring with increasing frequency. The recent success of Sputnik had stepped up the pace of superpower missile development and the arms race in general. The nuclear test program of both nations was proceeding at a frantic pace, leading to international fears about the effect of this saber rattling. Against this volatile background, the Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane in May 1960. The following year, in response to the West refusing to withdraw their armed forces from Berlin, the Warsaw Pact built the Berlin Wall. During this period, the readiness of the V-Force was constantly tested.
Temperature selector, normal. Temperature control switch.
When we were scrambled, there were occasions that we didn't know whether it was the real thing or not. Very often, we would be asleep, and came the call over the tannoy, and we would sprint for the aircraft. And the aircraft was always prepared carefully by us before we went. In other words, all your straps were laid out. You had your helmet plugged in and ready to go. And you had a strict drill, which we practiced a lot, to get on board in the right order, start the engines, throttles open, and away.
In the autumn of 1961, the Soviets shattered a recently agreed testing moratorium with the detonation of a monster H-bomb. To this day, its colossal yield of 57 megatons has never been exceeded. In response, the Americans immediately resumed their testing program with an extensive series of high-profile thermonuclear shots. The uneasy peace between East and West had never looked so shaky. Far worse was still to come, though. On Monday, October the 15th, 1962, an American U-2 photographed SS-4 nuclear missile launching sites in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from the coast of Florida. President Kennedy was informed the following morning and assembled his military advisors. Most of them recommended an airstrike to take out the Cuban bases, followed by an invasion. Kennedy immediately mobilized a vast army of men and material. The invasion plan called for the largest drop of paratroopers since D-Day. Strategic Air Command's fleet of well over 1,000 B-52 and B-47 bombers stood at DEFCON 2, the highest military alert short of all-out war. An eighth of these bombers were armed and in the air at all times, prepared to drop nuclear weapons on targets in Cuba and the Soviet Union. Pre-launch procedures were underway for the 172 intercontinental ballistic missiles ranged against the Russians. More than 100,000 combat-ready infantrymen were deployed to ports along the East Coast. And a huge Navy fleet, moments away from battle stations, was steaming through the international waters of the Caribbean. The American war machine was at its highest state of readiness, only awaiting the go signal from the White House. The Pentagon estimated that 18,500 Americans would be killed or wounded in the first 10 days of the battle. This influenced Kennedy's decision to forego an airstrike. Instead, the Americans imposed a blockade encircling the island.
This is Thomas H. Wolfe in Washington. An atmosphere of calm determination prevails today throughout the United States and reportedly throughout all the nations of the Western Hemisphere, as the United States begins to make effective a quarantine to prevent the delivery to Cuba of any further offensive military equipment from the Soviet Union. With the tranquil courage of the great leaders of democracy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy said to the communist world, "Enough." In his speech Monday night, Mr. Kennedy clearly spelled out that the United States action was being taken because, as the president phrased it, of, quote, unmistakable evidence, unquote, that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation in Cuba. Missile sites whose purpose, the president said, quote, can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere, unquote. Mr. Kennedy pointed out that it was Cuba and the Soviet Union who were responsible for the bellicose buildup. And he underlined the fact that the United States wants peace, not war. But he reminded the world that, quote, the 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war, unquote. Mr. Kennedy emphasized that aggressive actions by the Soviet Union had tremendously increased the threat of war, war which would lay open all the world to nuclear destruction. And so the issue is clear. The Soviets can end this crisis by the prompt dismantling and removing of offensive weapons in Cuba. And around the world, men and women today hope that they will do so.
The dangerousness of the situation was exacerbated by primitive international telecommunications. Khrushchev was unable to gain instant contact with his commanders in Cuba. Commanders that, unbeknown to the Americans, controlled tactical nuclear weapons that they were authorized to use if US forces invaded. The famous hotline directly linking the two superpower leaders was still a year away, preventing the possibility of direct dialogue between them. The line between London and Washington, though, was in frequent use as the Prime Minister urged the Americans to exercise restraint.
This is the destructive power we pray God we will never be called upon to hurl at any nation. But should it become necessary, let us not hesitate because it is foreign to our nature to use the power which has been given us.
Harold Macmillan, as he reflected later, was about to have the worst few days of his life. Events that would come back to him as recurring nightmares in later years. He was in charge of Britain's thermonuclear bombers and ordered them to Alert Condition 3, fully armed and at 15-minute readiness. He was determined not to give the order to go to Condition 2. This would have meant the disbursement of the H-bomb armed V-force to bases all over the British Isles. An act, it was thought, that would send out dangerous signals about Britain's preparations for an attack. As the crisis approached its climax during the last weekend in October, contingency arrangements were made to transport Macmillan and his war cabinet away from London to Turnstile.